Our guest today is Carol Hansell. Carol Hansell is the founding partner of a prestigious law firm here in Toronto called Hansell Limited. She's a former senior partner at Davies, Ward, Phillips & Weinberg in Toronto, and her practice centers around board and shareholder advisory work. Carol is recognized as an international expert in corporate governance. She is the author of the book entitled What Directors Need to Know, Corporate Governance. Our guest is a former director of the Bank of Canada and a former director of the Toronto East General Hospital. At the present time, she serves on the Dean's Advisory Council for the Schulich School of Business. She's a director of the Sick Kids Foundation, a director of the Global Risk Institute in Financial Services, director of the Toronto Symphony Orchestra, and governor of the International Corporate Governance Network in London, England. Our guest has been the recipient of numerous honors and awards, including just a few. Lexpert Zenith Award in 2013, a Fellow of the Institute of Corporate Directors, a recipient of the Queen Elizabeth Diamond Jubilee Medal. She is the top 25 Women of Influence, the Toronto Corporate Governance Lawyer of the Year in 2012, one of Canada's 100 most powerful women in the country, Teacher of the Year in 2007 at the Institute of Corporate Directors, recognized in corporate governance and corporate law as one of the best lawyers in Canada and the best of the best in corporate governance by the Guild to the world's leading women in business. Carol, welcome to the Ryerson Negotiation Project.
Thank you.
Carol, in your many, many different roles as counsel, board member, charity advisor, share with us a little bit what you do in terms of preparation for your negotiations, whether they be small or whether they be big.
Well, one of the most important things, David, I think is to understand what your client's objective is. So we are, as lawyers or as governance counsel, we're negotiating on behalf of our clients. We're agents for the clients. And so on any particular point, you could get to a number of different solutions. You could come at it from a number of different ways. But it's important that the client's tone, demeanor, posture, and their priorities certainly are being reflected in the negotiation. So it's important to spend a lot of time talking to your client about what they're trying to accomplish, what their actual end game is, as opposed to what the point is of that specific negotiation meeting, because it often sets the stage for subsequent discussions.
In the agency-principal relationship, do you drill down with your client in terms of expectations, deal breakers, et cetera, before the negotiations, or does this happen during the process of negotiation?
Always a bit of both, because it will never be possible for me to anticipate every nuance that's going to come out of the negotiation, and it will never occur to the client to surface all of their issues with counsel before we go into the negotiation. But again, I think it's important to understand that the negotiation, that particular meeting where points are going to be discussed, is probably one point in a broader spectrum of discussions that will happen. And so I would say to the client, what does success look like for you on this? Is there any fallback? Are there any?
What do they say when you ask the question about fallback? Is it, I often refer to that as concession.
Yeah. Well, I think everybody has their own strategy in terms of how they go into a negotiation. Some people will put one offer out and that's it, and they like to be known for that. Other people will try to get as far as they can, but that's much further than they have to get in order to meet their objectives. And unless I spend a lot of time talking to the client, unless they're open with me, I won't know what kind of negotiator they are. And so inevitably, we all have our own styles when we go into a room and negotiate on somebody else's behalf. But I need to be able to understand what the instruction means from the client. it creates a lot of difficulty for me as a negotiator if the client isn't being open with me about their strategy. So I think if there's not if a relationship hasn't been built between the negotiator and the principal, then it happens that the principal will play their strategy on the negotiator. So they will only tell me as much as they want me to give in that room, but I have no idea where else they would be prepared to go with it.
Do you find that happens a lot, where the principal says to the negotiator only certain things?
It happens a fair amount. It happens a fair. I think it depends a bit on the industry. I think with people who use a variety of different counsel for a lot of different things, they look at counsel as being a little bit more of a tool. So I will pick up this tool for this purpose and this tool for that purpose. So there is no relationship there, or it's not a relationship that the client is invested in. If there's a broader, certainly longer term relationship where I've worked with them before, or they expect to be working with me again, so that it's worth it to them to invest in the relationship, then we can have a broader discussion about where we're trying to go, and they will trust me not to take that negotiation any further than they've instructed me to take it. I think the fear is that if they give me their entire game plan, I will do with their game plan what I choose to do with their game plan, and they won't have any control over it.
Tell me the whole issue of relationships. Where does that fit for you in terms of your practice, your relationship with your principal, your relationship with the other side, the other client, the other lawyer? How do you work the relationship, as they say?
Oh, that's complicated. That's very complicated. So from the relationship's obviously critical, but I think from 2 points I would make to sort of frame the limits of the relationship. First of all, I think it's important, or I think clients expect that their negotiator, their counsel in my case, will go into a negotiation and have only their interests in mind. So if they're concerned that I am more worried about the relationship that I have with the lawyer on the other side because we work in a small community and my reputation or that relationship is going to be important to me in the future, the client will say, well, I don't know how tough she's going to be, or I don't know if she's prepared to do what I'm asking her to do if she has an interest in that ongoing relationship. It's inevitable. I deal with regulators, I deal with people in the justice system, I deal with government, I deal with other lawyers. And it's important to me, obviously, that those people continue to trust and respect me. But I have to be able to put that in a context where my conduct won't compromise the important part of that relationship with them, which is their trust and respect for me. But I can go into it in complete pursuit of my client's interests. So that's one important limitation from the perspective of a negotiator. The other perspective is I think it is difficult to give your client really good advice if you're personally invested in their deal. So you have to be able to step back and not be consumed with the passion of the particular point or the direction in which the negotiation is going in, so that you can step back for them and say, all right, I think we need to just look at where we are now and reassess. And that point may not matter, or that attitude coming from the other side may not matter if we talk about where it is we're trying to go and can we get past that.
Have you found yourself to be very disciplined in those kinds of things? Do you bite your tongue? You don't want to be involved passionately on a particular issue so that you can give the good advice to your client, but
Yeah, it's sometimes it's difficult because you obviously when you're working closely with somebody, generally you tend to come to care about the way they feel about things, and so they're being pleased with, not necessarily with me. I certainly hope they're pleased with me, but they're being pleased with the outcome. They're being happy about the progress. It's hard, and of course I care about that, but what I want them to be is happy with the deal at the end, and happy with the deal a year from now. So the moments as we're going through the process are less important. And so you have to have quite a thick skin and allow people to react to things that are happening when you're the only person in the room, and recognize they're not reacting to me. They're just, I happen to be the person that's there.
I mean, you have a stellar reputation in the legal business community here in Canada, but In terms of the balance that you might have to keep, yes, you're going to represent your principal, your client very, very well, but then you have a multi-parties that are out there, regulators, council on the other side, regulators, what have you. Any tips that come to mind in terms of how you balance those other things without turning them off completely?
I think it's not, I think it's a pretty clear path. I think, first of all, you always deal with everybody with courtesy. And courtesy.
So courtesy is still important.
Courtesy is so important. Courtesy is so important. And that extends to not just the manner in which you speak to people, but if somebody phones you, you phone them back. If somebody asks for an appointment, don't delay. If you're not going to be able to take the meeting, tell them you're not going to be able to take the meeting. So courtesy is important and integrity is important. And so I can't function as a professional unless the person to whom I'm speaking believes everything I say. So if you, David, say to me, did this happen? And I say, yes, it did happen. You can bank on that. I would not say it. I'm not being cute. I'm not couching it. And if I can't answer it, I'll just say, look, David, that's not for me to answer, or I'm not going to answer it. But you don't, I would not ever want to be in a position where somebody said, can't trust what she says. That'd be the end of my ability to function as a professional.
Tell us about Carol's communication style. Are you a phone person? Are you a text person? Are you a letter person? How do you deal with your client and persons on the other side, your communication style?
It's changed a lot since we both started, hasn't it? It's very different. So email is so helpful because it's quick and it's contained. So the whole, it doesn't sound like very much to have to pick up the phone, dial it, wait for it to go through, and have all the social conversation before you actually get to the substance of it. But nobody does that. It is time consuming. So the email aspect of things keeps things moving, keeps people up to date, and creates a record of things. So not only do they know, they can go back and look at what it was I said. I remember that I said it to them. So that is helpful. Email is problematic, obviously, because it's flat. It's subject to misinterpretation. If you're being quick about it, people can sometimes be offended.
Do you use email after you've, say for instance, you've given an undertaking? Do you send an email to counsel on the other side about that?
Yeah, I could do. It may be more likely for most counsel, if somebody gives me an undertaking, if they say they're going to do it, I would seldom think that I had to commit it to writing. I might do it just so that we're on the same page. I think, though, in terms of the important meetings that I do, it is kind of interesting. It's happened quite a lot recently. I do a lot of meetings in the downtown core, so you leave your office and go over to one of the other towers. And a lot of those meetings are really, they're conducted by phone. Even though we're all within 15 minutes of each other, I think it's important to go over to the client's office or have them come to yours. If we're on a conference call, particularly if the other side is on the line, it's critical to see the client's body language, to see whether they're engaged, to see whether they're reacting to it, to see whether I need to step in. It's very important.
So would I be right in assuming that you would prefer the in-person?
I'd prefer
particularly with the client, eh?
Well, even with the other side, because I think you're establishing, just even the back and forth we're establishing here is so much easier than if we were doing it. This is a much more effective way to talk to somebody than if we'd been doing this on the phone.
Tell me about developing the mandate with the client as you negotiate. We talked about the agent and the principal, but how do you get your mandate? What sort of demands do you make on the client? I'm aware of the retainer letter, et cetera, but are there particular protocols that you like to have as you embark upon a negotiation on a major initiative for a client?
If I can get them there, and again, it's a matter of whether the client is investing in me as a negotiator, I like to know there are, for everyone, although they may not think about it this way, there are critical issues that they are just never going to move on. They're just never, ever going to move on them. And it would be helpful if I knew that up front. So
Does that happen often, though, in your practice, that you get that right away? Or Do you have to wait until you get into the negotiations to find?
It depends. It depends very much. Again, I think it's a matter of how much the principal is prepared to invest in the relationship. So, an example that always comes to mind for me when I was a young lawyer and doing a lot of transaction work, papering the transactions, one of my clients was drafting something, and he said, "So the environmental rep, we don't assume any environmental liability at all. We just won't take on anybody's environmental liability." And I tried it on a couple of different ways, and he said, "Look, we're just not going to. We've never done it. We're never going to do it. So let's get that out on the table right now." I did a lot of work with them, and it was really helpful to be able to say to the client to the lawyer on the other side, "Look, this isn't ever going to change in this agreement. So let's not spend a lot of time on this. If it's a deal breaker, you better go back to your client because we are never going to change this provision. Never have. They say they never will." And that's very helpful.
What's been the experience when you've
It's
done
very,
it?
it's very effective. It's very effective because on a point like that, as a negotiator, I can't move. The client's told me I can't move, and there's no point in devoting a lot of resources to negotiating something we know I can't move on. It puts the other side on notice. If it is actually a business issue, the business people get together on it. It may, in a situation like that, it may affect the purchase price, for example. It may affect something else. But there's something else fundamental about the deal that will have to get changed. The negotiators are not going to be able to solve that problem. So if we can be clear about that from the beginning, the things that are just that the client is going to be intransigent on, it's important to them for some reason. It's really helpful to know that up front.
Back to the communications. How do you communicate back to your clients, your principal?
So one of the most important things I think is to do it really promptly. So if I'm working through something for the client, they may be very anxious about the fact that I'm now on the phone with the other side, or I had a meeting with the other side, and there is nothing that's more difficult for them than my going from that to 2 other meetings and updating them at the end of the day. So the exciting part about what I do is it is mission critical. Very often, typically, I would say to the client, it matters a lot. It's not routine work, but because it matters a lot, they're concerned. It's the most important thing on their desk, and so getting back to them quickly, if only to say, "I'm done, went well," something, or "What's your time frame? When can you be available?" So responsiveness quickly, because these things move so fast, is very important. Balance in the reporting back of the tone of the conversation is also very important.
Tell us about that.
Well, you see in many cases that a negotiator can really inflame their principal by reporting back every sarcastic comment, every stray nuance in the discussion, when really it might just have been the mood or the attitude of the negotiator. It has nothing to do with that negotiator's principle. And so unless it is really reflective of where the deal is going, if it's just the personal quirks of the person that you're negotiating with, it's not necessary to go through that with the client. Because if you're telling them, wow, there's heavy sarcasm on this point, they think they're supposed to take something. And it may not mean anything. And so you really need to understand how to frame the discussion so that the principal is getting the elements that they need without a lot of the drama that they're not going to, it will be difficult for them to know how to interpret.
So your judgment is certainly at play.
Mm-hmm.
And when you say getting back to the client, you do that email, telephone, in person, or a combination?
I would, if this were a negotiation and I were getting into a cab or walking back to the office right after this, I would be walking out, emailing the client saying, "I'm done, I'll be back in the office in 10 minutes.
Very good, very good. And clients must appreciate that.
I hope so.
Tell us, if you will, in terms of multi-party negotiations, any particular protocols that you adhere to or that you've noticed over the years in terms of multi-parties, the regulator, other counsel, other interests, stakeholders?
Expectations, making sure that your people are clear on what the expectations are, so that if you have a regulator, and they're all different. If the regulator is expecting, for example, that a press release won't go out until the regulator has seen it, making sure that they know that we're working on a press release, we think we're going to have it at X time. And the regulator is very sensitive to business pressures. If I were to say to a regulator, we're working on it now. It's probably not going to be done until about 11 o'clock at night, and it has to go out before the open tomorrow. Then they understand where it is they would feed in. If they're expecting to be updated on things, and that's often where the regulators will fit in. They want to know what's going on. Make sure they never have to call you. Make sure that they,
okay.
because otherwise the trust starts to break down. So it's inevitable that at some point you're going to drop something. At some point I will forget to call somebody when they were expecting me to, but they will understand that that's not, if I say, gee, I'm sorry, I did mean to get back to you, they'll accept that as opposed to, I wonder what game she's playing now. It's not helpful to introduce that kind of dynamic when you've got somebody who is not really in the center of the negotiation, but they do need to be kept up to date.
So with the multi-party, you have to manage the expectations of your own client.
Right.
And I guess of some of the other parties.
Each of the others, right. So the most difficult thing for people, I think, in those situations is knowing there's a lot of activity going on over here, but they don't know what it is. It's even sometimes worse for them. So one way or another, they're not hearing anything. There's radio silence here, and they don't know it. They still think there's a lot of activity going on, but somebody's not keeping them in the loop. So to say to them, look, we actually, I think we're going to put this down for a week, right? I don't think that there's going to be anything further to report over the weekend. That lets everybody else kind of relax. And again, assuming that you've established a relationship where they trust you, that works.
Where does the agenda fit into the process? Obviously you would work with your client in terms of what he or she may need in a particular negotiations, but do you work with counsel on the other side in terms of trying to have a formal agenda before negotiations proceed, or is this something that just evolves during a process? Because you might have 5 or 6 major issues you want to deal with. The other side might have 5 or 6. Do you keep them all together? How do you work that?
I do actually find, David, that there is not enough discipline around agendas, which is why meetings go on, for 4 and 5 hours. I'm not sure who's productive after 2 hours, but there's simply not enough discipline attached to having an agenda. I think it's important, for me, it's certainly important to know what your agenda is. I know what my agenda is. It's very helpful to me to know what it is you're trying to get out of this. So if you can, some people choose not to, that's kind of showing their hand. But if I run through my agenda and say I need to discuss these 6 points, that can sometimes create a sort of a flashpoint where somebody will say, well, I'm not talking about that, or I'm not authorized to talk about that, or the clients are offline dealing with that. If we can get to that place at the beginning, it provides a lot of shape to it. If somebody wants to move the items on the agenda around, it helps me to understand which issues they think are linked. If they say, look, we can't talk, that's the wrong order, that one doesn't matter, it's coming at the end, that's a big signal to me about where they're attaching the most value.
Do you find you get a lot of pushback on agenda items?
Not as much as again, because I don't think people, for the most part, have very much discipline about that kind of thing. If I introduce an agenda, they'll probably say, yeah, that's fine, and then immediately go off it. As soon as I start to follow the shape of the agenda, a lot of people will say, well, let's hang on a second, I'd rather talk about this. So it's often an introduction to a meeting that doesn't really form the shape of the meeting in any event.